current 2017 federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. While some states like California or Arizona have taken it into their own initiative to raise their minimum wage to around $10 an hour, the current minimum wage of $7.25 an hour has not been raised since July 2009, almost 10 years ago. Raising the federal minimum wage will have on-balance advantages and will benefit our economy today. By reducing poverty and creating more jobs, thus increasing consumer spending and boosting economic growth, these advantages will all become true through raising the federal minimum wage. Small families can't even afford to live above or on the poverty line. Basic things that we often buy every day, like a cup of coffee or food for dinner, they can't even think to spend on because they have to remember to pay for other things like food for the entire week or their mortgage or electricity. In an article by PBS in 2015, it stated, there are 1.3 million people working at the minimum wage, 1.7 million people working below the minimum wage, and 21 million people who are working above the minimum wage but below $10 an hour. Also, the cost of living has continually been increasing. Cups of coffee or food, bringing home food, or even a pair of shoes has continually been increasing. Therefore, how can a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour be able to afford these things such as we do today? Also, with this minimum wage increase, there will be less low-wage workers going to federal or government-aided programs. Because of this, there will be less government spending on these programs, and it will boost the economy. With this wage hike, these low-wage salary families that are above or on the poverty line will eventually transition to maybe lower-class families. Even though this is not a significant advantage, they will be able to afford more things as we do. In an article by the LA Times, it was stated that raising the federal minimum wage to $10.10 an hour over time, 6.8 million people will be lifted out of poverty. Raising the federal minimum wage will also create more jobs and therefore boost economic growth. Though it has been stated that raising the minimum wage has decreased employment, it is quite the contrary. In an article by the National Employment Law Project, it is shown that in 22 increases in the federal minimum wage between 1938 and 2009, there is no correlation between a federal minimum wage increase and lower employment levels, even in companies that are most impacted by these higher wages. States that have raised their minimum wage have in average seen their jobs have been added at a faster rate compared to those that have not raised their minimum wage. In one study by the NPR studying 13 states that have raised their minimum wage on the first of the year in 2014, it showed that the states that raised their minimum wage have seen a 0.85% increase in jobs compared to those that have not raised their minimum wage and have only seen a 0.61% increase. It is even so that in industries who would be most affected by this increase, the job rates would increase at a more substantial rate. Also, people with lower incomes are more prone to spend a greater amount of their salary than those with higher incomes. In an article by the EPI, raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, workers would take home about $35 billion in additional wages. Therefore, the U.S. economy would grow by about $22 billion. This means that billions of dollars of wages would be in the hands of those that make lower salaries, and therefore this money would be spent more in the economy and increase in consumer spending. This increase in consumer spending would again create a greater demand of goods and services. Therefore, employers would see the need to hire more employees, thus creating more jobs. Those who would be receiving these higher wages would also thrive in their employment. Because of such, there would be less employee turnover. Therefore, more employees would want to continue working in these jobs than coming and going because of a lower salary. This would increase employer productivity. Because of this increased employer productivity, the business would thrive and there would be more consumer spending. By reducing turnover of employees and increasing this job tenure, there would also be lower turnover costs for these businesses. Because of this, again, a business would thrive on this increased employer productivity, and business would thrive. Because of these points, by reducing poverty, creating more jobs, and increasing consumer spending, I hope you see that raising the minimum wage, while not void of disadvantages, does have a significant effect on our economy and our society today. Thank you.
All right, Christina, the wording of the proposition got a little bit complicated because you had a second part that you added at the back half. The secondary points, I couldn't tell if you had 3 or 4 or 5 supporting points, and when you got to the body of the speech, the material started to run together, so you need to structure it a little bit more for the listeners. It might look good on the page, but I think in the presentation, you have a tendency to run on to the next point without necessarily telling us why the point that you've just demonstrated is accurate or true. I saw a whole series of claims, for instance, where there was a good piece of information, grounds at the start of an argument, and then it was followed by a series of secondary claims which are not supported by anything except your inference, and then we get to another point, and we kind of go off on a different tangent and do the same thing. So you need to structure those more distinctly, and then in the body of those arguments you need to kind of explain how the secondary claims work by providing some evidence that shows that they work, not just asserting that they work and produce those particular outcomes. I did think that you had some good pieces of information, excuse me, some good pieces of information in your speech. You usually provide a source for the information. There's some good statistical, excuse me, some good statistical information in the presentation. Sorry about that. You have a tendency to rush through the information, and I think that that's another thing that makes the organizational structure a little bit harder to pick out. If you paced yourself a little bit more, it wouldn't feel like you were rushing to the next idea, and then maybe those ideas would come across a little bit more clearly. So the problem that I have mostly with the speech is that the body of the speech needs to be more clearly organized, and the claims need to be documented more on the assertions that you're making internally. The evidence that you had, like I said, was generally pretty good. Okay, thank you.